Imagine coming to school one day just to find out your teacher had become an adult star. Then hearing before that she had an affair with students in your school, maybe even in your class. Sounds outrageous, right? But what if I tell you that was the reality of students at one high school in the US? Ayana Roberts was the sort of teacher everyone admired. To her students, she was approachable and engaging, while to parents, she was the epitome of trustworthiness. Her warm smile and friendly demeanor had a magical way of drawing even the most disengaged students into her lessons. In her early 30s, Ayana was a striking woman with sharp features, curly brown hair cascading past her shoulders, and deep-set brown eyes that radiated warmth but hinted at an enigmatic depth. For nearly a decade, she had been teaching high school English, establishing herself as a compassionate educator who genuinely cared about her students' growth. Her reputation in the community was one of trust and reliability. Outside of the classroom, Ayana led a quiet, almost solitary life in a suburban town. She could often be found in quaint local cafes, nose buried in a novel, or animatedly participating in book club discussions. With her students, her interactions felt professional yet maternal. She stayed after school to help with assignments, listened to their problems, and offered advice like a mentor. She seemed to embody the ideal teacher, but beneath this polished exterior, Ayana was spiraling down a dark and destructive path, one that would shatter her carefully curated life and leave behind a trail of broken trust and emotional wreckage. The unraveling began innocently enough. Chris, a star athlete, was struggling with his English grades. He excelled on the field, but faltered in the classroom, a common scenario for students like him. Ayana saw his potential and decided to help, offering extra tutoring sessions. Chris, with his chiseled features, broad shoulders, and confident aura, was the epitome of popularity. Beneath the charm, however, lay insecurities that he rarely showed to others. Initially, the tutoring sessions were straightforward. Ayana encouraged him to explore the themes in the literature they studied, praising his efforts to boost his confidence. Over time, the lines began to blur. Ayana found herself complimenting him more often, her comments becoming less academic and more personal. Chris, in turn, leaned into her validation, savoring the attention she offered in a way that went beyond teacherly encouragement. The dynamic between them grew complex. Chris sought validation from an adult who viewed him as more than just an athlete, while Ayana, feeling flattered by his admiration, began to let her guard down. Their conversations drifted from academics to personal topics: his frustrations, her loneliness, her lack of a social life. Ayana, craving excitement, allowed herself to see Chris not as a student, but as someone who filled a void in her life. The first physical contact happened almost by accident during one of their sessions. Sitting side by side, their hands brushed. Ayana froze, but didn't pull away. Chris, emboldened, leaned in and kissed her. For a moment, Ayana resisted the alarm bells in her mind and responded, rationalizing it as a fleeting mistake. But it didn't stop there. Their relationship deepened, becoming more intimate with each passing week. Chris confided in her about his frustrations with girls his age, and Ayana, yearning for connection, began to believe their bond was special. The boundaries of their roles had vanished, replaced by a dangerous and forbidden intimacy. It wasn't long before another student, Max, began to notice the shift in Ayana's behavior. Max, sharp and observant, stayed late after class one evening and hinted at knowing about her interactions with Chris. Ayana tried to dismiss him, but Max had leverage. Unlike Chris, Max was calculating. He used what he knew to manipulate Ayana, pressuring her to give him the same attention she had given Chris. Arrant. As Ayana's situation spiraled, she became entangled in a web of lies and coercion. Chris, Max, and eventually other students began to demand her attention. What had started as a reckless mistake turned into a nightmare, with Ayana losing control over her life and her decisions. Hobart and Wilson, two other students, also grew suspicious. They approached Ayana separately, each with their own manipulative demands. By the time the new school year began, rumors were rampant, whispers turned into accusations, and Ayana found herself trapped. Hubert, cold and calculating, was the first to expose her. He leaked an incriminating photo, setting off a chain reaction. The school was in chaos, students whispered, and the administration launched an investigation. Aliana's life fell apart as more evidence surfaced. Parents demanded answers, and the media turned the scandal into a spectacle. They declared the whole thing to be a joke, which they regarded as an absolute horror, with scorns uttered. Ayana's once quiet existence was now a public disgrace. She was arrested, her career and reputation in ruins. The students who once admired her became her undoing. Trapped in a cycle of guilt, manipulation, and scandal, Ayana's story became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of the devastating consequences of crossing forbidden boundaries. Ayana's arrest marked the beginning of an unrelenting spiral. The mugshot, splashed across every local news outlet, transformed her into the face of a scandal that captivated the town. Reporters camped outside her home, neighbors whispered behind closed doors, and the community she once considered her safe haven turned its back on her. The police investigation uncovered a wealth of incriminating evidence. Text messages, photos, and detailed testimonies from Chris, Max, Hobart, and Wilson. While Chris's guilt was palpable in his statement, Max's calculated detachment painted him as a victim, manipulated by an older authority figure. Hobart, reveling in his role as the architect of Ayana's downfall, provided damning details with an unnerving lack of emotion. Wilson, less involved than the others, distanced himself by claiming ignorance, adding fuel to the fire with embellished accounts that further tarnished Ayana's reputation. The trial was swift but harrowing. The prosecution painted Ayana as a predator, preying on vulnerable students under the guise of mentorship. Her defense, thin and desperate, tried to argue that she had been manipulated by the boys, but the mounting evidence left little room for sympathy. Parents filled the courtroom, their outrage palpable, while reporters captured every grim moment. For Ayana, each day in court was a relentless reminder of her shattered life. The students she had once guided now testified against her, their words twisting the knife of betrayal. Chris's testimony was particularly gut-wrenching. His initial admiration for her had curdled into confusion and resentment, and his recounting of their relationship was laced with regret. By the trial's conclusion, Ayana was convicted on multiple charges, including statutory rape and child exploitation. The judge delivered a scathing rebuke, condemning her for abusing her position of power and betraying the trust of her students and community. The sentence was severe, a reflection of the gravity of her actions and the public demand for justice. In prison, Ayana had ample time to reflect on the choices that had led her to this point. The isolation was suffocating, but it forced her to confront the parts of herself she had long ignored. She thought of the students she had hurt, the families she had disappointed, and the version of herself she had lost along the way. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of her actions spread throughout the town. The school implemented stricter policies on teacher-student interactions, and discussions about power dynamics and boundaries became a central focus in classrooms and staff meetings. Chris, Max, Hobart, and Wilson struggled to process their own roles in the scandal. Chris withdrew from sports, his passion for football overshadowed by the weight of the events. Max, always calculating, used the notoriety to his advantage, crafting a narrative that absolved him of blame. Hobart, however, became an outcast, his enjoyment of Ayana's downfall alienating even his closest peers. Wilson faded into the background, his social connections frayed by the gossip and judgment surrounding the case. For the community, the scandal became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of how easily trust can be broken and how deeply the consequences of a single decision can ripple. Ayana's name was etched into the town's collective memory, a stark warning about the dangers of crossing boundaries and the irreparable harm it can cause. Years later, the memory of Ayanna Roberts still lingered in the halls of the school she once called home. For some, she was a tragic figure, undone by her own flaws and loneliness. For others, she was a symbol of betrayal, a reminder that even those we admire can fall. But for everyone touched by the scandal, one truth remained: trust, once broken, is a fragile thing to mend. Wouldn't you love to subscribe right now, as this documentary gets even more interesting? However, the story didn't simply conclude with Ayanna's arrest. Her downfall left an indelible mark on the boys she had once taught, and their attempts to move forward were fraught with struggles. Each of them carried the weight of their involvement, in their own way, forever changed by the scandal that had enveloped their lives. Chris, burdened by overwhelming guilt, dropped out of school and fell into a profound depression. He blamed himself for everything that had transpired, convinced that he had been the catalyst for the tragedy. Racked with self-recrimination, Chris isolated himself, cutting off contact with his friends and retreating into a life of solitude and regret. The bright, ambitious teenager he once was became a shadow of his former self, consumed by an unshakable sense of responsibility for the chain of events that had destroyed so many lives. Max, ever the pragmatist, took a different approach. He sought to turn the situation to his advantage, granting an exclusive interview to a local news station. In it, he portrayed himself as a naive and impressionable student who had been manipulated by a cunning and predatory teacher. The media devoured his story, and for a fleeting moment, Max basked in the limelight, enjoying his 15 minutes of fame. Yet, fame, as he quickly learned, is fleeting. As public interest waned and the scandal receded from the headlines, Max was left to confront the stark reality of his actions. He began to realize that his involvement in the ordeal had left a lasting stain on his reputation, one that would follow him into adulthood. Aubert, the self-proclaimed instigator, initially revealed the intention, boasting about his role in exposing Ayanna's misconduct. But as time passed, his bravado began to wear thin. His constant need for validation and recognition alienated his peers, and he eventually found himself ostracized by his classmates. Aubert had built his identity around the scandal, but when it faded from the public consciousness, he was left with a hollow existence, unable to move forward or redefine himself beyond the events of the past. Said Aubert. Wilson, who had been the least involved in the scandal, made a quiet attempt to rebuild his life. He transferred to another school, hoping for a fresh start away from the whispers and judgment. Yet, no matter where he went, the shadow of Ayanna's actions and his tenuous connection to the scandal followed him. His new classmates knew of his past, and their murmurs and side glances reminded him that escape was impossible. Wilson lived with the constant reminder that he too was marked by the scandal, a quiet, inescapable stigma that shaped his every interaction. As for Ayanna, her story took a darker turn. She faced a grueling and highly publicized court battle. Her defense attorneys argued that she had been vulnerable, manipulated by the boys rather than the other way around. Yet the evidence was damning, and the jury was unmoved by her pleas. Ayanna was convicted of multiple counts of statutory rape and sentenced to several years in prison. The teacher, once admired by her students and colleagues, became a symbol of betrayal and abuse of power, her career and personal life irrevocably shattered. The years Ayanna spent in prison were a crucible, marked by regret and self-reflection. The confines of her cell became a harsh reminder of the choices that had led her there. Stripped of her dignity, identity, and future, she grappled with the enormity of her actions. The trust she had betrayed, the students she had harmed, and the career she had thrown away. At first, Ayanna kept to herself, shunned by her fellow inmates who knew her story all too well. Over time, however, she adapted to the brutal realities of prison life, growing harder and more resilient. Even in confinement, a dangerous part of Ayanna lingered, the part of her that craved validation and adoration. This insatiable need for attention had fueled her downfall and would continue to haunt her. When her release date finally arrived, The world outside felt both familiar and alien. Ayana, older and tougher now, stepped into a society that had moved on, but had not forgotten her everywhere, preventing her from finding steady work or rebuilding her life. Desperate to survive, Ayana turned to an unlikely and controversial avenue: the adult entertainment industry. There, her notorious past became an asset rather than a liability. Under a pseudonym, she began creating content, initially hiding her identity, but eventually leveraging her notoriety to gain visibility. The public was fascinated by her transformation from disgraced teacher to adult performer, and her videos quickly gained traction. However, the new chapter in Ayana's life came with its own challenges. The fame and money brought a fleeting sense of control, but they could not erase the guilt or fill the void left by her shattered dreams. As her career in the industry began to wane, Ayana found herself questioning whether survival had come at too high a price. Ultimately, she decided to leave the industry and start new. Moving to a small town where no one knew her, Ayana found solace in the quiet anonymity of managing a bookstore. Though the scars of her past would never fully heal, she began to piece together a life of peace and introspection, far removed from the chaos and controversy that had once defined her. For Ayana Roberts and the boys whose lives she altered, the journey forward was not one of redemption, but of survival. Each bore the weight of their experiences, their lives forever shaped by a story with no winners, only lessons learned, in the shadow of irreversible mistakes. Years later, the whispers of Ayana Roberts' scandal had mostly faded from the collective memory of the world. Time, as it often does, has moved on, leaving only a faint shadow of the once intense media frenzy. The small town where Ayana had chosen to rebuild her life remained blissfully unaware of her past. To them, she was just Ayana, the quiet, reserved manager of the local bookstore, who always seemed to have a kind word for anyone who walked through the door. Ayana spent her days surrounded by books, her sanctuary. Stories of redemption, growth, and second chances became her solace, their words guiding her in ways therapy never could. Occasionally, she would recognize parallels between herself and the characters, their struggles mirroring her own. It was in these quiet moments of reflection that she found strength to keep going. One afternoon, as the golden hues of a late summer sunset poured through the shop's windows, a familiar face walked in. Ayana froze. It was Wilson. Older, taller, and carrying a demeanor of calm maturity, but unmistakably Wilson. Her heart pounded in her chest as memories she had long buried came rushing back. He scanned the shelves, seemingly unaware of her presence, until his eyes landed on her. There was a flicker of recognition, a moment of hesitation. Ayana felt exposed, as though every ounce of progress she had made was now laid bare. Yet, Wilson didn't storm out or confront her. Instead, he walked over, his expression unreadable. "Ayana," he said, his voice steady. "It's been a long time." Hearing her name from someone who knew her past felt like an intrusion, but she nodded, managing a faint smile. "Yes, it has," she replied, unsure of what else to say. They stood there, the weight of their shared history thick in the air. Finally, Wilson broke the silence. "I wasn't sure it was you," he admitted. I didn't expect to ever see you again." Ayana braced herself for anger, for condemnation, but none came. Instead, Wilson's eyes softened. "You seem different," he said after a pause. "I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't this." "Listen," she swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she replied, "I've tried to change. I've tried to move on." Wilson nodded. "We all have." They talked for a while, their conversation cautious but genuine. Wilson shared bits about his life, how he had eventually found stability and was working as a counselor, helping at-risk youth. He didn't explicitly say it, but Ayana could sense that his career choice was deeply influenced by what had happened all those years ago. As they spoke, Ayana felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not hope for forgiveness. She knew she didn't deserve that. But hope that maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild some semblance of connection with the people she had wronged. When Wilson finally left, he didn't offer forgiveness, but he didn't offer condemnation either. "Take care, Ayana," he said, and there was a softness in his tone that left her feeling lighter. After that encounter, Ayana realized that moving forward wasn't just about leaving the past behind. It was about acknowledging it, facing it, and finding ways to grow despite it. Over time, she began to reach out to the others, carefully, cautiously. Not all responded, and not all encounters were as civil as her meeting with Wilson, but she persisted, not seeking redemption, but hoping for closure. In the end, Ayana's life didn't become a perfect story of redemption or reinvention. It remained messy, complicated, and marked by her past, but it was hers. A life she had fought to rebuild piece by piece. And while the scars of her choices would never fully fade, they no longer defined her. She had learned to live with them. And for Ayana Roberts, that was enough. Please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.